Hello, everybody. We will wait until we all get here. Welcome. If you want in the chat, we'll do what we've been doing every week, which is we will write one being, be it vegetal, microbial, viral, folkloric, that we've interacted with in the past day, or the past week, and kind of create our holobiont being. So who am I gonna offer? The corvid, the whole corvid family, the blue jays, the crows, all of the trickster birds with their theory of mind. Interesting articles about crow intelligence that always, betray our very anthropocentric ideas of what cognition is. Okay, great. So today we are talking about liberation, libation, and leaven, and vegetal gods of anarchy and revolt. And on the Discord, and this will be sent out again, I've put a lot of my own research, which is about talking about how before the advent of science and microscopes, we understood that the greatest magic and alchemy happened through these beings we couldn't see. And so we personified them as, Dionysus or Osiris, these gods of fermentation and agriculture and ecstatic revelry, and oftentimes revolutionary impulses that were problematic for empire. But now, as we're beginning to see science and myth collide, we see, sometimes I say the fairies, the myths, the deities haven't disappeared, they've just reappeared under the microscope. They've gotten even smaller, the fairies have gotten even smaller. So today, to begin us, so Juliana Furci, who's the head of the Fungi Foundation, is going to give us a real deep dive into fungal science and fungal biodiversity, and how fungi underpin, our mythologies, our actual livelihood, our ecosystems, and that will be sent out tomorrow. And Juliana is incredible, and the work that she's doing with the Fungi Foundation is really, really important and fascinating. But to start us off today, we have David Zilber, who is one of my favorite writers, thinkers, chefs. Here, I think the bio will do better. David Zilber is a professional chef, fermenter, photographer, and an author of the Noma Guide to Fermentation, hailing from Toronto, Canada. Notably, he served as the director of the world-renowned fermentation lab at Restaurant Noma. He has become a voice for science communication for a new generation of cooks and enthusiasts in the world of food and fermentation, and currently works as a food scientist on the frontiers of flavor and innovation, employing the help of microbes to build a more just and sustainable food system for all. And so I think David is a really good person to walk us through how fermentation and civilization and agriculture and cooking and appetites and flavor are all woven together in a really complicated and interesting way. So I'm going to hand it over to David.
Thank you, Sophie. And hello, everyone. Thanks for having me on this delightful, very dark Monday evening here in Denmark. But yeah, I'll just get into it because I could talk about this for days, and I think we only have an hour. And I'm also really happy about kind of the scope that Sophie invited me to examine, because fermentation goes, it's indelibly linked to like the dawn of life on Earth, which is fascinating. Just to touch on that briefly, if life came about as we think it did in hydrothermal vents deep in the ocean's depths and interior, in these little pockets where these rare earth metals help to catalyze reactions and fix carbon out of basically the belly of the mantle as it streamed into the cooler seas. Some of the first metabolic pathways to arise were fermentation pathways. For life to exist, obviously you need DNA, you need a cell. That's all well and good. You can find lots of these, the organic molecules on meteorites in space. We've detected ethanol floating in gas clouds of nebula millions of light years away. But for life to exist as we know it, you need an important molecule, sugar. As far as we understand it, that we can't have life without some sort of nucleic acid. some sort of information holding mechanism. And the first ones we believe to arise were RNA. Now, what's RNA? Ribonucleic acid. The important, prefix in that very complicated molecule's name is ribose, which is a 5-carbon sugar. It is fundamentally the backbone of nucleic acids bound to phosphate. But what's great about ribose is not only is it structural and can hold information through some nifty molecular bonding, but it can also serve as a fuel source. So early on in life's history on Earth, we had a molecule, RNA, that could serve as life's first information documentation system. But RNA is pretty nifty in that not only can it serve as an information carrying system, it can also serve as an enzyme, almost like a protein, which can also break down things like ribose. So the very first metabolic pathways to arise, in living organisms at all, were thought to be fermentation pathways that we still see within the bodies of microbes to this day, which we still see within our own bodies to this day. Human cells can burn glucose, can burn energy in one of two ways. We can either do it very slowly in our cells, cytoplasm, via fermentation, or we can do it at a much more efficient rate in our mitochondria through oxygenated respiration. But the fact that when you, let's say, are exercising and your body and your muscle cells can't get oxygen fast enough that you revert to fermentation and you start bleeding out, things like lactic acid into your bloodstream and feel the burn, you are in effect remembering this ancient time on Earth. Your body recalls really, the dawn of biology, the dawn of everything. But what is fermentation beyond, this archaic, very ancient, Hadean, if you will, life force? Well, to me, as a chef, and I think as most people will understand, fermentation is the transformation of one ingredient into another with the help of a microbe. Zoologist Douglas Levy has pointed out that from an anthropological point of view, deliberate fermentation can best be seen as controlled spoilage. And that's an important thing to denote here, is that, yes, rotting happens all the time. If fermentation happened in hydrothermal vents 3.7 billion years ago of its own volition, in the bodies of some of the world's first archaea and bacteria, and it still happens on the side of a road, let's say, on the way to work today, I noticed a pear tree, like a wild pear tree in the forest by my lab. And, I looked at its base and saw rotting fruit, that had both frozen and thawed. We had a recent snow here and it was well on its way. Now, fermentation is happening in that fruit, but so is a whole mess of other things. There was also mold on the fruit. There was also, like bugs crawling through it. So decomposition is kind of like the set that encompasses fermentation. And in my definition of fermentation, the transformation of one ingredient into another, we have to think that ingredients are things that humans consider to be valuable to their own propagation, to their own fitness, to their own flourishing. There are lots of things that we don't consider ingredients in the natural world. When we harvest radishes from the field, we leave the tops to rot. You can eat radish tops, but lots of people don't consider them ingredients. Lots of people throw them out. Carrot tops, the skins of vegetables, coconut husks. We don't consider all of these things to be ingredients. It's the human choice to delineate what part of an animal, what part of a plant is or is not conducive to our own well-being that we apply the term ingredient to. So in that transformation, when microbes get involved, there is an important kind of, third actor. It's not just ingredient, microbe, ingredient. Human volition, human consciousness has a big role to play in deciding what forms of spoilage are allowed to proceed. In the Noma guide that I wrote, I talk about fermentation as, well, a club, really, and as a fermenter, you're the bouncer. And fermentation's a hot club. It is the hottest ticket in town. It's the one everyone wants to get into. It's the one with the best champagne. But as the bouncer, you're deciding what microbes are allowed into the party. You're deciding who's going to make the party pop and who would, eventually have the cops called on the joint. And that's the point, is that human intent has a huge part in this, and we'll touch on that more later on. Now, fermentation has been applied throughout history in lots of different ways. Sometimes we do it because we enjoy it, just for its tastes and its flavors. Sometimes we do it out of the need to preserve foods. Most microbes can't persist in even like moderate concentrations of alcohol or lactic acid. So by, kind of tweaking the control levers on the board with whatever means we have available to us, even in Neolithic times, the removal of oxygen by filling a jar or a gourd up to its brim, salting things, burying them in anaerobic bogs, all sorts of these tactics that ancient humans had at their disposal gave us the ability to control things that we knew almost nothing about. We might not have known about aerobic or anaerobic respiration or fermentation pathways or what enzymes were necessarily, but we knew how to, at a macro level, through tradition, through myth, through oral communication across generations, we knew what worked and what didn't work. Neolithic farmers were obviously able to preserve much of the nutritional values of their crops, if not its freshness, through these kind of ancient intuited acts of fermentation. And we can't talk about, the birth of fermentation and how far back it stretches in human history without talking about alcohol, because it kind of sits at the center of this whole thing. In nature, any concentrated source of protein, of sugar, of nutrients, I'm surrounded by plants in my apartment, not that you can see them. Here's one. Maybe I can stretch them into view. A living organism enacts homeostasis to keep itself at a, well, this is going to be a kind of a funny statement, at an equilibrated disequilibrium. The best way I could describe it is life is constantly bringing an escalator up to meet your maker in heaven. And living organisms are a slinky falling down, wanting to be here on earth and live out their mortal lives. So long as the slinky's springs stay springy, a living organism can fight that pull up to heaven or wherever it might be going, and stay in this kind of static dynamism, if you will. It can kind of run to stay in the same place. Some biologists call this the Red Queen effect. Famously in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, the Red Queen had to run constantly to stay in the same place. Life does that all the time too. So when any food source, even an animal, ceases to be able to maintain homeostasis, things creep in. We have to remember that life is everywhere on Earth. Even in the most arid desert, you will find bacterial spores, albeit sparsely distributed, that, come the rainy season, which might be years or decades away in their intervals, will reactivate these organisms and allow them to flourish and spread and be fruitful and multiply. Life is everywhere around us and inside of us, constantly trying to make its way into these pockets of concentrated energy sources. And it's only by living that we can hold them at bay. Here's a great example. This is a little bit of a tangent, excuse me, but from our own microbiome. Inside your small intestine is this extremely rippled and kind of folded over structure at the microscopic level. It's covered in what are called villi. And you need as much surface area as possible in your small intestine to allow for maximum absorption of all the things you consume and ingest and digest. This barrier is obviously kind of like the prime barrier, your lungs being another one, into your body. And it needs to be kind of very safely mediated, if you will. You know, your body basically needs a bouncer to make sure who's allowed to get in and who isn't. Your body's bouncer is a mucous membrane, and your gut is constantly producing mucus to coat and ensure that your gut doesn't leak and that things that should not get into your bloodstream don't. Fascinatingly, your body's villi, your small intestine's villi, are also covered in billions of microbes that are invited to the party to consume that mucus. They're called mucophiles, at exactly the rate that your body produces it. Now, should they get too fast, they'll make their way inside your gut, and you can end up with things like Crohn's disease and all sorts of illnesses and ailments. And should they consume it too slowly, then there's a buildup, and then other things can creep in because they won't divide fast enough to basically block out the competition just by virtue of their being there. So that's a great example of this constant kind of push-pull, this dynamic equilibrium, if you will, that all of life inside and outside and in ecosystems and all around us, constantly in the process of enacting to ensure that things maintain the illusion of stability, if you will, at least over the scale of lifetimes. The same thing happens for food out there in the world. You know, if fruit falls from a tree, once it's disconnected from its parent plant, it's on its own. There might be a handful of chemicals in there, you know, polyphenols that are involved in the browning of apples or bananas that can stave off microbial or fungal activity for a little while, but eventually life will creep in. And you know, outside, apart from honey, some of the best concentrated sources of sugar, like biology's prime macro molecule of energy storage, is fruit. So going back into, you know, evolutionary history, into geological time, once, and Sophie's talked about this a bunch, once seaweeds became plants and made their way onto land, you know, back in the day, in the day of the lycopedrons, and the day of like the scale trees, all of the trees that made all of the coal on Earth, that towered in barren forests for hundreds of millions of years, when they started to diversify and the angiosperms, the flowering plants, came onto the scene late in the age of the dinosaurs, fruit exploded. The angiosperms, the flowering plants, are the most successful plant species on Earth, or sorry, not species, like family, if you will. You know, the vast majority of the genetic diversity of all plants is contained within the flowering plants. And again, they only came about, you know, in the past, let's say 100 million years. And their fruit, and their flowers and their nectar and their ability to attract species across domains of life, and not just from you know, not just from the plant kingdom into the animal kingdom, also into the microbial kingdom, is key to their success. The smell of spontaneously fermented ethanol has guided primate ancestors to the ripest, most sugar-laden fruit and trees for millions of years. Many primates are trichromats. We have the ability to see red, green, and blue, and lots of other mammals are only dichromatic, like dogs, for example. They say dogs only see in black and white. That's not true. They just lack the ability to see, they just lack the retinal cones to be able to differentiate green light with, you know, as good precision as we can. Now, the reason for that evolution or that evolutionary advantage that primates hold, that lots of arboreal species hold, is the differentiation between unripe and ripe fruit. That's an amazing signal that has co-evolved between, flowering plant species and the animals that consumed and distributed those fruits. It's almost like we tapped into this other layer of reality to be able to say, oh, we can access another, kind of like hidden secret code within, the electromagnetic spectrum to have this conversation between just the two of us. And I'll let you know through my enzymes, through all of my evolved trickery, when my baby is perfectly ripe for you. I will release, maturation enzymes that will degrade starches into sugars and allow you, dear primate, to run off with my child. I will pay you for its consumption. Just you make sure to take it far away from me so you can spread my seeds into the wilderness and spread me around the world. This has worked time and time again. Robert Dudley has famously developed the drunken monkey hypothesis that gives an evolutionary explanation for the human predilection for alcohol. And he points out that our heritage is, of course, a fruit-eating one. And almost certainly the very first primates were frugivores. Our early relatives moved from the leaves onto non-fruit plants, but we retained that love for alcohol and sweetness. Now, this divergence from the trees down onto, the plains of Africa happened some maybe 7 million years ago. And along with that came a tiny change in our DNA sequence that allows us to produce an enzyme that's super efficient at breaking down alcohol. This is called alcohol dehydrogenase. Homo sapiens, with our creative evolved brains, took this ability to amp up alcohol breakdown, and it allowed us to propel our pursuit of alcohol into completely new cultural domains. Just to let you understand this, alcohol is a poison. Lots of the products of fermentation are exclusionary chemicals. They are kind of little side streams in either the Krebs cycle or other metabolic pathways where one molecule in what's normally like a daisy chain of metabolic flux can be produced en masse if it confers an advantage onto the organism that's producing it. So things like citric acid, lactic acid, and ethanol are all great when produced in sufficient enough quantities to be able to kind of fence off a single grape, if you will. If it gets alcoholic enough, stray bacteria, stray amoebas won't be able to survive in those environments. And the yeast or the bacteria that are producing these acids or these poisons will be able to completely consume it for their own good, hang out there until they find another sugar source, and then go on to colonize whole swaths of land. So the switch from poison to food source was an important one. About 1/10 of the human liver's processing capacity is devoted to breaking down alcohol via the production of enzymes like alcohol dehydrogenase, which is kind of fascinating. Now, because alcohol is so addictive and this like very carefully mediated, basically inhibitor to normal functioning, it was inevitable that lots of individuals would overconsume. And that somehow these behaviors would be tied or recognized as social evils. In Africa, for example, I have this great video from this 1970s documentary called Animals Are People Too, that I used to show on the book tour for the Noma Guide to Fermentation, where you see elephants, capuchin monkeys, I think there were warthogs and what's Timon? Meerkats feasting off of the rotting fruit of the marula fruit tree. And if you've ever tasted marula fruit in Africa, I had it for the first time in Zimbabwe. It is like eating into a sugar tart. It is so incredibly sweet. And elephants actually migrate, across hundreds of kilometers at these seasonally timed intervals to feast off of not the fresh fruit, but the rotting fruit. And in this video, it's hilarious because the animals are visibly drunk, which goes to show you that not only is fermentation as a pathway, not only does it stretch back like to time immemorial, to the dawn of life on Earth, but the decided consumption of fermented foods does not solely belong to human intent or human consciousness. There are lots of animals that will deliberately seek it out. And this isn't even, I don't even have time to talk about like ants and leaf cutters and basically the domestication of fungi that built whole. We don't even have time to get into that. But just know that fermentation and basically all life is this kind of central node, if you will, this kind of keystone in between lots of species interactions that become ritualized and become mythologies in their own right. To speak to that, there are plenty of ancient gods dedicated to fermentation. In the Baltics, there's Raguten and Ragupatis, who are the gods of fermentation and of beer, respectively. They're partners. In Mexico, you have Mahahuel, who is the goddess of pulque, Bacchus and Dionysus, Roman and Greek, respectively, gods of wine. Silenus was a companion and tutor to the wine god, Dionysus. Varuni, the Hindu god of wine. Bamweje was the West African Hausa spirit of drunkenness. And the list goes on and on and on. There's actually a Wikipedia article dedicated to this, and it's like 50 lines long. And those are just known examples. But the point is that alcohol, out of any form of fermentation, is usually the easiest one to kind of self-start and the easiest one to isolate. It should be noted that hunter-gatherers may have had lots of ways to interact with the living world. They could, forage for grains, for tubers. They could hunt. They could preserve their kills by burying them in tundra or, permafrost. They could salt them. Ancient Australian Aborigines have great traditions of fermenting in seawater, in little kind of dugout caves underneath the earth. But 11,000 years ago, in kind of what is Eurasia and Africa, the kind of like large chunk of the world, people began to experiment with kind of semi-permanent settles based on agriculture, and that kind of changed the game. The village of Areni, in what is now Armenia, is home to the world's oldest winery. The caves of Areni are famous in anthropology as being kind of renowned for their ability to have preserved for thousands of years both human remains and archaeological remains. These were cave-dwelling people. They would go in there that basically make these kind of semi-permanent dwellings. And while it wasn't necessarily a stratified society, this was maybe one of the best and earliest examples in this region, basically the Caucasus Mountains going into Göbekli Tepe in what's now Turkey, Iran, Armenia. This is kind of a great example of this slow transition to what we consider like the agricultural revolution. It was not a direct kind of de facto overnight, a bunch of people deciding, oh, hey, let's set up camp here and never leave. I've got all these seeds with me. We're going to plant, a field and live our life from there on out. No, it was kind of this like, hey, this place is good for a while. Let's hang out here. Let's go foraging in these vicinities. But I also figured out that, there's this pot of land over there with a lot of this fruit tree, and we can kind of take care of it and make sure that it's going to be here year after year. So there was this kind of constant dabbling with agriculture that happened for thousands of years. We can look back at really, really ancient times and say, oh, no one was farming. 60,000 years ago, as we view farming today. But we should also note that that transition wasn't black and white. It wasn't this kind of binary switch. Just like if you zoom in on the stock market close enough, you can never really discern a trend. It looks completely chaotic. But over, vast swaths of times from, let's say, the 1900s to today, there has definitely been a trend. More wealth has been created in, the public sector. Even if people's individual stocks might go up and down, people might go bankrupt, companies might come in and out of existence. It looks like chaos on the small scale, but it's only over, the vast expanse of history that you can tell that there was this widespread trend. So the first tangible evidence that we have of fermentation anywhere comes from this region in Armenia. It is pottery. It's pottery that has been stained with the remnants of wine that was turned into eventually vinegar. Now, Sandor Katz makes a really good point about this, and it can be kind of discerned from any readings on the subject. If elephants, which have existed on Earth for tens of millions of years, can have a culture dedicated to basically a festival of fermented fruit and its consumption, and baboons and capuchin monkeys can as well, who's to say that humans haven't been doing it for the exact same amount of time? And with our big brains, haven't been engaging in it with more fervor, if you will. And like I said, Sandor Katz points out a good kind of not so obvious point. When anthropologists talk about the first evidence of wine production in the Caucasus Mountains, that date going back to 6500 BC isn't the date that humans started fermenting. It's the date humans figured out how to make pottery. It's the date humans left a tangible record that we could look at today. Because if you're fermenting in a dried out gourd, well, that's gone in a couple of years' time. But if you're fermenting in stone and under the right conditions in, let's say, a deep and dry cave, that will persist when other things won't. But it should also be noted that, that's kind of like the Western history of fermentation. In China, 8,000 years ago as well, there's also evidence of basically their version of beer production. This was made from fermented rice mixed with honey and fruits. And it was based on local cereals that they had available to them. Also dates back to, like the Chinese history of pottery production. As that became available, it was the first time they were able to leave records of these things as well. So while it is great that the Chinese were kind of messing around with grains and mixing them in these kind of hybrid ferments that they would have consumed as alcohol, it should be noted that there is a big difference in between the ability to harvest grains and then store them and transform them deliberately versus like the marula trees in Africa, finding something that's readily available to ferment. And the best source out of any of these is, of course, honey. Honey is the most concentrated sugar source in the natural world. No fruit gets anywhere near it. It's usually by weight, 65 to 75% of three simple sugars. And under the right conditions, let's say that you have a hive bored out into the knot of a tree and you have a heavy storm come through. Under the right conditions, if that honey gets dilute enough, well, it's all of a sudden dilute enough for microbes to take hold. Honey is full of yeast and bacteria, but they're in stasis. Honey is naturally antiseptic because it is so sweetly concentrated, and because of the hygroscopic nature of sugars at such concentrations, it'll pull water away from any other source. which lowers what's called the water activity for microbes to a point where they can't thrive. They might be kind of frozen in stasis. They might go into like spore mode, but they can't live in environments like that. So under sufficient dilution, you can have spontaneous fermentation. You can kickstart these microbes into existence, just like an oasis rain in a desert, but this time in a food source, and not only harvest the honey for, you know, the delicious rare food source that it is, as ancient honey hunters did, you know, 8,000–10,000 years ago. You start to kind of get drunk on the matter too, which is fascinating in itself. But the transition, you know, from these kind of like instances of either happenstance where, you know, these ancient humans could gather natural ferments in the wild, or these kind of proto-agricultural communities where these loose bands might come together at certain parts of the year, where they might primarily be fishers or foragers, but have some small amount of, you know, vines or fruit trees available to them for these kind of special occasion ferments. Over time, eventually there was this mass effect reached. You see this, and its best example in the Indus Valley, in the early Indus Valley civilizations in you know, south of Pakistan, I believe. Sorry, I don't have a map in front of me right now. And that was fascinating because you had these large and stratified communities that were centered around floodplain agriculture, the same that you would find eventually, if not almost concurrently, in the Nile Delta as well. And floodplains are amazing places for humanity to set up, because they kind of collect and concentrate all of the decayed nutrients during the rainy season and deposit them in very shallow waters in advance of the next dry season for whatever communities happen to be living there. And it's very easy to start up agriculture in these vicinities because you basically have this natural irrigation system with the most fertile soil on Earth. So basically, the point is that you can support huge quantities of people on a very small swath of land. You know, it's estimated that for traditional hunter-gatherer societies, and don't quote me here, I don't have the figure in front of me right now, but I think it's something like to sustain someone like the Kalahari Bushmen of you know, southern Africa. I think they need something like 10 square kilometers per capita of like roaming range to be able to, you know, hunt their animals, to be able to gather their food. And that's kind of how much space they need. Now, translate that to the density of modern day Calcutta or Manhattan or even Copenhagen, and you find that we are completely dependent on, you know, intensive agriculture outside of our main domains. And that all happens, of course, with modern day farming. But in between those extremes, the very first civilizations to pop up were ones that were situated on these river deltas. They were fantastic at, like I said, being able to irrigate crops, and people quite quickly understood what crops fed them the best. We were naturally attracted to the pulses, to you know, the ancient wheats like emmer and barley that had the biggest grains that were by no mistake the most protein rich. But an important thing is usually left out of this picture, and that's the fact that grains on their own are not great food sources. You will eventually die of pellagra or anemia or other nutrient deficiencies if you're just eating gruel. But you can survive off bread and beer. There are ancient tablets that date back, you know, to these ancient Babylonian civilizations in the Indus Valley that talk about indentured slaves that were required to build these castles to whatever warlords happened to be ruling these regions at that time. And their payment was like a daily ration of beer. Now, this is very different beer from the beer that we know today. If I were to go to the fridge and crack a cold one, that's filtered, it's high alcohol. Now, the beer back then was basically like a barley porridge that was lightly fermented over the course of a couple of days. But the alcohol level of just like 2 or 3% was enough to keep lots of microbes out, and people knew that. But not only was it enough to exclude pathogens and purify the water source that they were using, microbes also have the ability to create nutrients where there were no nutrients before. Cows, for example, are 1 or like 500 kilogram, half-ton walking hunks of meat that if you hunt them or if you farm them, you can survive off them for a lifetime, as many people have. But all cows eat is grass, and grass is notoriously nutrient deficient. So how then do cows turn grass into their bodies? Well, they don't. Their microbes do. Cows are walking fermenters. Cows take up grass, they mulch it, they swallow it, they let it fester in an acidic solution to initially break it down, they regurgitate it, they swallow it again. And then when it ends up in their caisson, their fermenting stomach, methanogenic bacteria get to work on it and start degrading, using their own enzymes, the complex cellulose and lignin molecules that plants produce to protect themselves against easy consumption that animals have no ability to consume themselves. And it's only because of the microbes that cows carry in them that feast off of all of the cellulose, that transform the cellulose into all of the amino acids of their own bacterial cells, that cows can consume the bacteria and build their bodies. So cows, let's say, aren't so much herbivores as they are bacteriivores. And the same is true for horses, and the same is true for termites, and the same is true for humans. We would never have been able to build complex societies or extracted the amount or extracted the density of energy available to us through agriculture if we had not had microbes with us to transform these simple crops into fermented foods like bread and beer that were not just more nutritious for us, but also had the amazing and remarkable capacity to be both cellarable, and I'm quoting, sorry, I'm quoting James C. Scott here, divisible, accessible, storable, and of course, fermentable. But these amazing crops at their core formed the basis of modern civilizations. Pulses like chickpeas and soybeans in East Asia, sorghum in Africa, maize and beans in Mesoamerica. Everywhere around the world, you saw these kind of not just triumvirates of pulses and grains and people. What's the next level up after a triumvirate where you have 4 parties? But microbes are always central to the story as well. The Mayans, for example, are another great example that I just kind of mentioned. Ancestral maize harvested by the Maya is not the corn that we know today. Teosinte is famously the classic, very small, kind of husky little innocuous grass that you would walk over if you saw it in a field. But ancient Mayan corn wasn't quite that modern corn that we understand corn on the cob to be today. Domestication and breeding hadn't transformed it into that. And that came with its own kind of boons and pitfalls. But the maize of the Maya had kind of flint-like seeds rounded and hard shells or seed coats that made them, of course, less edible, but protected the kernel against lots of crop pests until the cobs matured. The Maya discovered the ingenious discovery, not of fermentation, but of adding lime or potash to the mixture as they cooked the maize to help break down the cellulose layer in the process of what's called nixtamalization. Now, when European settlers came to North America and started eating maize, they all suffered, like, they got rickets and pellagra and had all sorts of these nutrient deficiencies because they weren't nixtamalizing their corn. But beyond nixtamalization, fermentation also makes corn more edible. So the combination, what's called, the three sisters of maize, beans, and squash, this American trinity, has the ability to kind of be a complete diet, and was for the ancient Maya. Beans had the advantage of being able to carry out symbiotic nitrogen fixation into the soil, fixing it from the atmosphere. Squashes of vine sported large leaves that, when grown beneath tall stalks of maize, shaded the ground to protect against overheated or desiccated soils, and also suppressed weeds from being able to prop up. And when you ate all these three things together, you had this complete diet. But the fermentation of the corn into things like chicha or pulque added this extra boon that also kind of sat at the core of Mayan civilization. As fermentation did across lots of different empires. I realize that I am like almost out of time here. It's already like almost 6:50, and we still have to open up for Q&A. But I've yet to even talk about like ancient Egypt, which was founded on the ancient tradition of making like aish baladi, which is this ancient Egyptian bread that you can still buy on the streets of Cairo today. Granaries and fermentaries were like one and the same. So you had women that were constantly day and night grinding grain into fine powder to bake bread or to ferment into beer. Beer that was what the slaves that built the pyramids were paid in, and that's what they celebrated with. When they managed to move each brick over the top. Not only it was arduous work, of course, but they also celebrated and reveled in it. And I think there have been like stories of like inscriptions like, "Yay, like we finished our work. Now we get to rejoice with beer," carved into the ancient pyramids. So Egypt itself, which was like the longest spanning civilization in history, continuously populated empire that humanity's ever built, was founded off of this braid between agriculture and the microbes that transform that agriculture into a consumable and nutrient-rich food source that sustained them for, like I said, thousands of years. Now, I'm really fast forwarding through like human history here, but enter the expansion of modern societies into Northern Europe, around the Mediterranean, going up into Greece, when the Phoenicians were kind of battling for that area, and then all the way into like modern Rome. You saw the same thing. So let me just kind of center myself in my notes here and find the fastest ones to wrap up with. Barley was consumed as bread and beer by slaves and peasants in Athenian armies, and when those armies were on military campaigns. And Romans used barley and wheat for baking, but they didn't consume it in large quantities for alcohol, as they much preferred fermented grapes. There's this famous quote from the Greek historian Thucydides that wrote, the people of the Mediterranean began to emerge from barbarism when they learned to cultivate the olive and the vine. But bread was still always central as kind of this food source, like the panis quadratus, if you will, to Roman and Athenian life. But surely, dealing with grapes as that tradition from, the Caucasus Mountains spread, with human history, as people migrated, they took grape seeds with them. And there have been amazing genealogical studies of the transmission of, what's the species name? Vitis sylvestris, the common wine grape, across Northern Europe, into France, into Rome, all these places. But they loved it for their symposia, which was the ancient Greek tradition of consuming wine and basically philosophizing, tapping into the spirits of the gods that conferred them with these amazing transformative ingredients that were not just obviously healthy for them, and void of pathogens, and they knew that wines were safe to eat, things like that, but also were mind altering and transformative. And maybe that's why there always has been such a connection between, the supernatural and fermentation, because not only is the products of fermented foods, not only are the products of fermentation nutritious, as of course they are, but they also have the ability to change you, to change your thought patterns, to be able to, spur on conversation, ease inhibitions, and act as kind of like the grease of the social enterprise that is humanity. Romans copied the ancient Greeks, as they did in many respects, with what are called Roman convivia, where they kind of did the same thing, but the Romans got a little bit carried away with it. And these convivia, which of course is the root word of conviviality, also kind of in the tail end of the Roman Empire devolved, if you will, into orgies and other kind of more lewd parties. But it should be noted that the degeneration of the Roman Empire was kind of like an ecological crisis of their own making. Grain supply in ancient Italy evolved from abundant local production to the complete destruction of local environments, and soil erosion on a scale that has not been seen in ancient history, until they were completely dependent on imported grain supplies for the fermentation of these crops into the foods that kept Rome alive. Romans were completely dependent on wheat from far off colonies, and the expanse of the Roman Empire was driven largely by the need to grow wheat for Rome, as it was dependent on it for its sustenance. The Punic Wars with Carthage were about gaining wheat output of Sicily and North Africa, and other fermentation technologies like fish sauce, which also went on to fuel the Roman war machine as well. But the biggest boon was Julius Caesar's addition of the grain output of Egypt, Gaul, and Spain to the grain supply of Rome. So at the height of the Roman Empire, its borders expanded to encompass all available land suitable for the production of wheat primarily. And that's what kind of helped to define the borders of the empire itself, was where could they grow wheat to ferment into bread and beer, to feed the army that could then look for more land to grow more wheat that Rome would tax to fuel its consumption of bread and beer, and so on and so on and so on. So you can see how what fermentation was in the early days of Neolithic human life, this kind of dabbling into the spiritual, a play farm where you would have a small amount of wild grapes that you would treat as civiculture, which is the cared agriculture of wild trees. You would ferment them carefully. And these were things that were done in the homesteads. Over time, this kind of reliant boon on the transformative properties of microbes for increased energy output kind of inverted this like trophic pyramid, these interactions between humans and wild plants into one of like complete dependency. Eventually, a compounding of climactic events, disease, drought, the plague, kind of pushed Rome over the edge, and they were unable to contain control of their wheat empire, and eventually it collapsed. But it's also kind of this prescient retelling of history that, the things that we look to ameliorate or speed up our ways of life, our dependencies, can also be, the linchpin that, should it snap, spells our downfall. And it's like almost an hour now, and we still have 15 minutes for Q&A. I still want to talk to Sophie a little bit. So I will skip talking about the British Empire and how the production of grain and the harvesting of sugar for, rum, and the fermentation of tea, and all of this played into the development of the slave trade and the transition into a pre-industrial to a post-industrial world. But rest assured that fermentation has always been central to the development of human civilization. John Chiara has this famous quote that civilization and fermentation are inseparable. And it is true. It is absolutely true. There is not a culture on earth that does not ferment their food. Our modern world is built on it. 1 out of every 3 calories that you put into your mouth is touched by fermentation in some way, shape, or form. All of the tastiest condiments or anything that you would actually want to eat, be it a cheese or a mustard or a hot sauce, anything that adds flavor and spice to your life, enjoyment, wine, bread, any of it, are the products of microbes. And that is a testament to the idea of microbial terroir. It's like, yes, plants can be of a place, vanilla trees are the terroir of Madagascar. Just as, spruce trees might be the terroir of Canada, where I grew up. But without microbes, we would not have the vanilla bean. Without microbes, we would not have the flavor of pickled spruce tips. And that's kind of the point, is that the players might constantly change, as all ecosystems do. They're constantly shifting. But what microbes bring to the table is far more profound and really truly a mirror to their forms of diversity. It's estimated that there could be as much as 1 trillion microbial species on Earth, which is insane because there's only something like maybe like 16 million species of animals and some like 500,000 species of plants. But that is absolutely dwarfed by the amount of bacterial, fungal, and archaeal diversity. And in some ways, it doesn't even make sense to speak about bacteria as having distinct species because they are so mutable and they are so adaptable and they are so ubiquitous that whenever they do get into our food and manage to not hurt us, we cozy up to them and find their unique voices that echo up through the scales of life. We find their phenotypic effects, the compounds they produce, the enzymes, so enthralling and captivating and mind-altering that we build myths and deities and temples around them. We dedicate the world's first banks and granaries and fermentories and institutions around them. And much of the world's modern economy is still dedicated to them. I mean, just look at it this way. I haven't even gotten to talk about oil yet, and that would take another hour. But all the fossil fuels that make any of this possible, me sitting in my apartment, you looking at me on Zoom, all the fossil fuels that we mine out of the earth, they're not dinosaur fossils like you saw in cartoons as a kid. No, those are algae. Those are microscopic transformers themselves, harvesters of sunlight, that have held on to the energy and compounded it in the belly of the earth over hundreds of millions of years. So again, we also kind of rely on these microbial processes for every aspect of, the world that we know and love. And there is something to be said about this kind of inversion in that respect too, but I digress. Anyway, that's me waxing about microbes and civilization, and I took way too many notes down, and I probably only got through half of them. But this is like, it's big. It touches everything. And I guess we can have a little chat, Sophie, if you'd like, before we open it up to questions.
Unfortunately, we're running on a pretty strict schedule, and
okay.
Chiara starts at 1, but I think we have time for one question that I probably shouldn't take up. I should open it up to someone else. Someone says, what does this have to do with mythology? Mythology is personified elementals. Every single deity that we've talked about so far is at its core a microbial deity. And we think of the sciences and mythology as being mutually exclusive, but mythology is an ancient dialoguing with the elements, with these processes that then fuel our complex cosmologies and cultures. So that's my little response to something in the chat. And if you're familiar with my work, you'll know that it is microbio focused. Okay, so if someone wants to hop off, let's take Jose. I think you're up there. Can we unmute you? Hello.
Oh, sorry, I had to unmute. Hi, David, quick question. I am always interested in how trauma and psychology kind of interact with our cravings, so to speak. Because like obviously on a day-to-day basis, anyone can relate that the more unhappy you are, the more you're kind of susceptible to wanting fat or sugar. And the happier you are, the easier it is to eat healthily. So I don't know if you've looked into that or you have anything to comment on that, on basically how did the human condition and internal sort of happiness or stress state, nervous system regulation kind of affect maybe these processes on a large scale and like motivate some diets over other diets?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not an expert in, I would say very few people are an expert in like the minutia of like gut microbial brain mood interactions. The closest answer I can talk to you about is that, if you have like when you're stressed, your body produces hormones that affect, it's like a cascade of, and that's by design. Like being stressed, being depressed back in the day kind of served the purpose of like, hey, you should move, you should go somewhere else.
Yeah.
If you're feeling gloomy, like go find a sunny place because there will be food there. So it's not like depression is all bad or has no like evolutionary impetus, let's say. But when you are stressed, there is this like cascade of hormones that are released through your body, and your microbes interact with those hormones. And there are very complex interactions that happen that go beyond my scope of education. But being stressed can change your microbial communities. And when those communities fluctuate, they might start asking for different things. And that goes on to create feedback effects. And let's say you start eating unhealthily, and all of a sudden, rich fats or a lack of fiber might diminish a population of bacteria in your hindgut that would normally produce a metabolite that would signal to your, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. It's more complex than I understand. I would definitely look up the work of Tim Spector, Suzanne Devkota, or Justin Sonnenberg, who are all PhDs in human microbiome research. They are smarter than I am about that aspect of things.
Yeah, like, are there any books on kind of that feedback loop, like unhappy people seeking a certain diet, which facilitates a certain type of civilization because of that agriculture, and then people are more unhappy, and then they seek out a diet even more? Like, is there any literature on that?
None that I know of that speak to it on like an anthropological level. I think that I think that would be kind of a stretch to understand if that had happened. Like, we can only talk about those things as we study them today.
Yeah, it's just something I want to learn about, so that's what I was asking. If there's anything.
There's two books on my shelf. Maybe you've already read them. I Contain Multitudes by Ed Yong, and where's the other one?
Probiotic is also another one by Jamie Lorimer.
Yes, that's also on my shelf, but I haven't read that yet. And 10% Human, by Alana Colleen, which is also a great one.
Thank you so much.
I think both those books touch on it. Read them for yourself, but they're not completely dedicated to it. It talks about all of human microbe interactions.
Yeah, ultimately you got to mix and match books.
Yeah,
it's different fields. All right, thanks.
David, everyone wants a part 2 with you, so maybe we'll have to talk about, because I thought that was the most fascinating thing I've ever heard. I'm gonna have to go back and take notes. Amazing. I was also just thinking about the preponderance of cattle cults, like these earliest ritual cultures that we see, and then the fact that cows are these walking fermenters. So I'm just having all of these aha moments. We're gonna probably have to say goodbye now. We are so grateful, and we will, I will bug you again at some point, maybe with all of these questions that people are asking. So thank you.
We could probably spend another hour just on a Q&A, and I think that would also be like really fun.
Yeah.
Okay, but thank you all.
Thank you, David.
It has been fantastic getting to eat lots of cabbage.
Grain is a great book about grain in the state, someone just said. So I'll put that in the resources. Thank you, David. Okay, so Chiara, I want to ask you, we've run a little bit over. So we usually take a wiggle break. Do you have time for a wiggle break, or would you like for us to go into your session? What is easiest for you, given your schedule?
No, I'm okay with schedule, and I think it's good for the people also to have a bit of a pause to integrate.
Okay, so we're all gonna take about a 5-minute wiggle break where we're gonna move around, go to the bathroom, get a drink of water, and then we'll come back, and Chiara is going to tell us about Dionysus, who is a fermented god. So we're gonna move from the science ecological aspect into the political, anthropological, and mythic zone. So thank you, everyone. See you in a second. Okay, I think we're slowly going to transition back into being here. Chiara, it is incredible and an honor to have you here. I'm going to read your introduction and then I'm just going to let you go right in. So let me get that up. Chiara Baldini is a researcher and freelance curator from Florence, Italy. She investigates the evolution of the ecstatic cult in the West, particularly in ancient Greece and Rome, contributing to anthologies, psychedelic conferences, and festivals. She is the program curator of Boom Festival's cultural area, Liminal Village. She has recently co-curated an anthology called Psychedelic Mysteries of the Feminine. She is currently a PhD candidate at the California Institute of Integral Studies. She has been living in Portugal for the past 11 years, and she often plays as DJ Clandestina. Okay, Chiara, please welcome us into the Dionysian mysteries.
Thank you so much, Sophie. How exciting. I'm super happy to be here. Thank you everyone for coming. I think this is the biggest online presentation I've ever given. So thank you for coming to listen to me talking about something that moves me so profoundly and gives me so much joy, because this is a research I've been doing on and off for almost 20 years. It started very spontaneously. I'm mainly a raver before being a scholar. And so only recently I decided to bring my research within a more like institutional space. So thank you very much. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let me see if I'm able to do this. Does everybody see? Okay. So I called my presentation Collective Effervescence, also in honor of the framing that Sophie is giving to all of these topics, and I really appreciated this perspective on fermentation and bacteria. And yeah, as she said, we're going to speak about Dionysus, and more specifically, we're going to have an overview of the political and social aspects of this cult, from more or less from the 15th century BC until the Roman times. So it's a long stretch of time. I'm gonna outline one possible story among many other, like there's an ecosystem of perspectives. And so, yeah, bear with me. I'm also going to mention some new information for the first time. I'm connecting dots for the first time in this presentation, more specifically. So, yeah, I'm excited about that. Let me see how I move on. So, collective effervescence. This concept comes from Emile Durkheim, who is an anthropologist from the beginning of the 20th century. And he says that collective effervescence is a sociological concept. A community or society may at times come together and simultaneously communicate the same thought and participate in the same action. So there is pointing to some collective, joined, maybe even rhythmic action that can really create something. When it's happening with a group, it can create a kind of energy that is defined as effervescence. And such an event can cause, then causes collective effervescence, which excites individuals and serves the unify of the group, serves to unify the group. So this is the concept that I'm going to develop in this presentation. So why does collective effervescence unify groups, create a bond, create a unified intention, and how did people, and specifically us in the West, have been using this tool, this technology, to create different outcomes in our civilization? So we're going to speak about Dionysus. Probably most of you have heard of him. And he is the god of fermentation and of collective effervescence par excellence. So he's generally known as the god of wine and intoxication, usually represented drinking or so drunk that he needs to be carried away by the faithful Ariadne here. But actually also this denomination of god of wine is a later denomination, because originally he's a vegetation god, and he's defined as the power of the tree, the blossom bringer, the fruit bringer. So if we focus for a moment on these definitions that are quotes from ancient literature, we can start feeling that Dionysus represents the kind of energy that pushes the plant out of the seed. You know, the energy that allows nature to reproduce itself and creating more life and more life and more life. And so that's also why he is considered the archetypal image of indestructible life. And this same energy that push the fruits and the flowers to open and the mushrooms and funguses to come out from the spores, this is the same energy that is also present in the sexual energy. It's the same energy that allows humans to be attracted to each other, but also animals. So it pervades everything. Humans, animals, plants, it's everywhere. And mythologically, it was associated with this name. So yeah, this is just a quote to reconnect with the sexual pleasure and sexual energy, which is such a big part of the mythology of Dionysus. And so the first time that we have his name written down, it's on a linear B tablet dating to the 1300 BC, coming from Mycenaean Crete. So Crete is this island in the south of Greece. Probably you've heard about it. It's considered the birthplace of the first civilization in Europe, called the Minoans. And after the Minoans came the Mycenaeans, which invaded and brought another kind of scripture, because the first one was linear A, which is still not deciphered. So linear B has been deciphered, and this is actually the actual tablet mentioning his name within a temple, probably just creating a bit of accountancy of how much wine was stored or was gifted in honor of the god. So Minoan society, I want to speak a bit about this civilization from which this lineage of Dionysus came forward. Of course, Dionysus is the kind of god that you find in many different civilizations, including Shiva in India. I wrote an essay about this. There's many similarities and correspondences that are very interesting. But so the lineage coming from Minoan Crete. So the Minoans were a very specific kind of civilizations, because according to many researchers, this is the last pre-patriarchal society to exist in Europe and even to enter into the historical phase. With linear A, they were the first civilization to have a writing in Europe, but their values and social structure was very different than any other civilization that were their contemporaries, like the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Hittite, I never know how to pronounce this, from Mesopotamia. And so, as we can see in this image already, we can see that there is a female figure, bare-breasted. We never wear, again, that mature to allow women to go around, and priestesses and goddesses to be represented bare-breasted. And so there's this female figure, maybe a goddess, maybe a priestess, being honored. There's gifts being brought to her. So this is already telling us that women had a very special position in this civilization. And yeah, the religious importance was bordering also, was merging with the political and the social role that women had in this time. But we can also see on the left of this image There are some figures that are colored brown, which is the color coding for male, also present in the Egyptian iconography. And we can see that there's some males dressed as women and being part, playing instruments, being part of these processions with female priestesses. So this is also a civilization where gender was fluid. And we also have women participating in bull leaping, in the bull leaping ceremonies or competitions. So we have male and female being able to perform different social roles. And yeah, and in this case, also women, men dressed as women, it was part of their religion. So all of these you can find in this beautiful book by Ryan Eisler. But if someone tells you that she's too feminist or only women read her books, as it's also sometimes the case with Maria Gimbutas, from which Ryan Eisler took a lot of information and inspiration, you can also mention that Minoan culture is defined as pre-patriarchal, women-centered society, also by David Graeber, the late anthropologist, very famous, The Dawn of Everything, major book that came out recently. There's a whole chapter about Crete and Minoans and what an incredible culture they were. A few more informations about Minoan Crete. The palaces, probably you've heard about them. Knossos is the most famous one. They were huge complexes. They were named palaces as if they were the dwellings of an elite. But actually, recent research proves that because there were no walls, they were very open to the people and probably built by the people themselves as a joint effort of different communities and not as an imposition of the elite over the masses like it was in the Egyptian times. And these spaces had a lot of storage rooms and workshops and different ceremonial spaces. So they were more like a communitarian space rather than elite dwellings. And so yeah, so this is to say that their social structure was not as hierarchical as their contemporaries. And so the differences between the people were not so stark, and also wealth was distributed in a very different way than we are used to when we think about archaic societies. And so they are defined as peaceful and egalitarian matricultural societies of consensus. Probably decisions were taken by councils, probably in the councils were sitting grandmothers, which were the clan leaders. And so there's a lot to say about Minoans. I don't want to go too much into this. But yeah, generally, there is a lack of evidence of rigid social, political, and administrative hierarchies. So what I want to say, Dionysus comes from a culture that was egalitarian, peaceful, and where women had a central role, and also where fermented drinks were drank. Recent archaeology found, especially archaeochemistry, as a new discipline of archaeology, they found this Minoan ritual cocktail, which was a mixture of wine, beer, and fermented honey. So David before was talking about these different drinks. The Minoans were putting them all together very interestingly. So Ryan Eisler says, especially fascinated is how our modern belief that government should be representative of the interests of the people seems to have been foreshadowed in Minoan Crete, long before the so-called birth of democracy in classical Greek times. So pre-democratic, like a form of proto-democracy is probably what was happening there. And from a religious perspective, we have quite a few representations of this mountain mother. So this mother goddess represented on top of mountains, flanked by wild felines. We have this same iconography associated to other goddesses coming from Anatolia. And so here in Crete, we have one of these archetypes represented. So this is the connection with Dionysus that I want to make. In the 8th century BC, so after the Dark Ages, after the fall of the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, there was a period of not much happening, let's say. But then as Greek culture was starting to be formed and coming out of this dark period, we know of these early Dionysian rituals that were performed by women only, the Maenads or Bacchantes. Probably you've heard of them. Their name is connected to reveling or going crazy or raging on top of mountains by themselves without males, dressed in fawn skins, brandishing snakes, holding the thyrsus, this fennel wand with a pine cone on top. This is the classical iconography. Maybe you've already seen some examples. This is a modern interpretation. And I speak about the role of women in the cult of Dionysus in my chapter in this anthology that I curated. So if you're interested in going deeper into that, I advise that you read our book and my chapter. And so to revel, what does it mean? So the Maenads, the Bacchantes were the revelers, to dance, to sing, to enjoy yourself with others in a noisy way, celebrate, have a party, to rave, have a good time, make the town red, very interesting expression, especially if we're talking about women, take pleasure in, luxuriate on, get a kick out, make whoopee. I found this in a dictionary. I think the Bacchantes were doing something, were making something a bit more than whoopee, but it's interesting to see where their name comes from. Their ritual was called orebasia, from oros, which in Greek is mountain. And here we can see a representation of what they did on the mountain, because of course we don't have any direct testimony of women telling us what they did. We have some second or third hand information, but we have, we can look at iconography and get some inspiration. So they were professional trance music makers and trance music dancers. So trance, because they use this shamanic drum, the frame drum, it's common to many different civilizations all over the world. So they knew the rhythm patterns that were needed for the body to enter into an altered state of consciousness. They were masters in this. They were not like crazy women lost on the mountains. They really knew what they were doing. The rhythm patterns were handed down generation after generation, together with the movements of the body, which were very specific. Again, nothing was just random, but part of an uninterrupted lineage going back possibly to Minoan Crete, but probably also earlier. They were also the ones foraging and mixing, fermenting, and knowing everything about plants. The gatherers, the ones that knew how to make different potions for healing or for ceremonial purposes, mixing different things. So Greek wine is not like our wine, which is just grapes, fermented grapes, but Greek wine was a mixture of many different things, and often the alcohol was used to dissolve many other different ingredients that they would put. And here we see that they are adding different things to this mixture. So the wine that they drank was not just to get drunk, but probably also to get the kind of high that you would get on psychedelics. There is different theories. What did they use? Probably also mushrooms, maybe opium, maybe henbane, cannabis. Many are the possible ingredients. And so the kind of effect was very different than just getting drunk, and the kind of effect that would really allow the god of ecstasy to possess them and to inspire them and to allow them to enter into an altered state of consciousness that was called mania by Plato. He defines many different kinds of mania, and the telestic mania is the Dionysian one for the ceremonies. Teletes were the ceremonies. So yeah, these were states where you can meet the divine, you can merge with nature, you are one with nature, you're one with the wild animals and with wild nature. That's why also they go on top of the mountains. It's a body-based kind of mysticism, very typical of shamanic cultures, and this is a form of European shamanic cultural lineage. My definition of why they needed this kind of experience, one of the possible reasons, was because they were trainings in liminality. So liminal space is the space in between. In these rituals, they could have a full body experience of being male and female at the same time, human and animal at the same time, wild and civilized, and terrestrial and divine. So these dichotomies were fused in one, and you could experience the paradoxical nature of reality, because reality very seldomly is black or white, and this was a way to really embody this paradox of being alive. So with time, now I'm gonna speed up in terms of chronology. With time, men were welcomed in the rituals, more or less 6th century BC. And this is the time of transition from a more tyrannical way of organizing society with a very strict, with the elite on top, let's say, towards a more democratic system. And not only men were included, but also different kinds of genders, or homosexuality was very welcome. Dionysus himself is an androgynous god, or we would say today non-binary. And so there would be a gender fluidity part of this culture that was very important. We will reconnect with it later. So the rituals would be organized by these private associations. They're called theasy. And these associations are open to everyone. So women have a major role. Everyone, including slaves and immigrants, were welcome as equals in these associations. And so the more that the cult spread, the more that the Dionysian practice spread, the more theasy started appearing. And together, all of these different associations formed a kind of social strata of people that were used to taking decisions, to deal with each other, to organize their rituals in a way that was very different from the hierarchical structure that was the political structure at that moment, before the democratic turn. And so, yeah, here, because I don't see, because, yeah, anyway. So the theasy helped the unfolding of Athenian democracy in the 5th century BC, because the egalitarian practices and freedom of expression practiced in the Dionysian meetings and rituals made it possible for many Athenians to imagine an alternative way of relating and organizing themselves, open to all, where status differentiation could be limited or eliminated, and self-expression could be truly free. So thanks to the practice of the rituals themselves, but also to the way that they organize themselves in terms of decisions, because everybody had the same vote. So no matter what was your social provenance, you would have one vote in the decision-making structure. And so enough people had this way of thinking and acting that together they supported the enactment of a series of very swift reformations that happened in this very short amount of time between 6th and 5th century BC, which allowed the birth of democracy. This is something that I only found written last year in this book called Religion in Human Evolution by Robert Bellah. And yeah, it opened a new horizon to me, and I want to bring it here for the first time. And so to say these democratic values probably were coming from Minoan Crete, and because religion is more conservative than other areas of society, probably they were really conserved within the Dionysian practice. Of course, big difference than Minoan Crete. Democracy didn't allow women to have the same rights of men. So let's remember that this is the birth of patriarchy. Democracy in Athens was a patriarchal enterprise. And so, yeah, women retained their power only within the rituals, which is not a small thing, but they wouldn't be allowed to vote and have the same right to vote than men. So, yeah, so a new idea of a different social reality than the one existing was possible through this process. And because of the concrete experiences that people had in the rituals of, as I said, being in between and being able to imagine a different way of being, and they were also supporting the actualization of democracy. So, and again, fast forward a little bit, not too much, the Dionysian rituals are spreading and spreading. There is private initiations, there is public processions, there is the birth of theater. Each one of these is a separate presentation. But now where I want to go is what happened in Rome when the cult started spreading. Rome was very religiously tolerant, because if the religion was authorized by the Senate, then it could be practiced by the people. They said, pax deorum, pax hominum. So if the gods are in peace, the men are in peace as well. And so many different cults were celebrated in Rome if they were authorized by the Senate. But the Dionysian cult, Dionysus became Bacchus from Bacchus, the reveler. Also Bacchantes come from Bacchus, this word, to revel. And the rituals became the Bacchanalia. It spread without the authorization of the Senate. It spread from the lower classes, and probably from southern Italy, which was an area where Greek influence was stronger. But also there was a god in Etruria, where I live, modern-day Tuscany. The Etruscans also had their Dionysus called Fufluns. And so there was a very ripe field there for the cult of Bacchus to take foot. Do you say this? Sometimes I say this, I don't know if they're correct in English. Anyway, it spread like wildfire. Many people were initiated, and it started getting out of hand. And the Roman Senate, which was very conservative, started wanting to do something about it. So membership was open to everyone, as I said before, also in this case. Women had prominent positions because they could initiate men, which was a subversion of the hierarchical kind of order that was already in Rome, because Rome at this time, we're talking about the 2nd century BC, was very militarized, very hierarchical, very misogynist. Rituals broke rigid conventions of gender, social status, ethnic origin of the people, because you had immigrants and you had slaves again. And so this created a very, sharing certain very extreme experiences together, like a bacchanalia. People had the chance to create a bond among them that could have been stronger than the bond connecting the Roman citizens with the Senate. And this was what was scary for the Senate. They were scared to lose control on the people. And so in 186 BC, there is this event called Bacchanalia Affair, which is something that I didn't study in school. I had to research to find it. And it's a very interesting episode of Roman history where the Bacchanalia were repressed. And to do this, they fabricated a false scandal. I'm not going to go into this, but I want to go into what we have as the speech that the consuls gave to the General Assembly to convince the people that they needed to repress the Bacchanalia. Of course, they were going to be very careful with this because they knew that this was a tradition coming from Greece, which were, you know, the Greeks were very valued in terms of culture, also in Rome. And they knew that this god was an ancient god. And so they were, you know, they had to create the needs of this repression in a very sophisticated way. And so we know about this story from Titus Livy, which is one of the Roman historians. He writes 200 years later from the event. And from him, we have the text of Consul Lucius Postumius speaking to the General Assembly. And then I would say something else also in terms of sources. Where do we get this information from? So the movement still has no power, but it is experiencing a large increase in numbers, growing bigger every day. It has almost formed a parallel city. So parallel city in terms of two different kinds of people inhabiting the same city with different belief systems and different value system. One very hierarchical, the other egalitarian. One misogynist, the other really honoring the place of women and other genders and sexual orientations besides heterosexuality. And so it was starting to be dangerous, this parallel city, this metaphor. I really like it, to really feel there is another people within our people. A great part of them are women, and they are the source of this evil thing. Next are males, scarcely distinguishable from females, dancing frenetically, having lost their minds by lack of sleep, by drink, by the confusion and shouting that goes on throughout the night. So he says, these are a bunch of dancing freaks. The men, you cannot even tell if they are men or women. They lost their mind. So I like this story because we can hear also the echo has reached us, and sometimes our politicians describe raves in the same way, or when there is this electronic music events and they want to repress them, like it happened in England with the Rave Act in the 90s, but also recently in Italy, it's happening again. And so, yeah, we can see how Lucius Postumius is describing the followers of Bacchus. Citizens of Rome, Do you feel that young men initiated by this oath of allegiance should be made soldiers? Will they take the sword to fight to the end in defense of the chastity of your wives and children? So these are dancing freaks. They're not soldiers. And here Lucius Postumius is really triggering the fear in men and also male pride. You know, we are soldiers, we need to defend our wives and children. This is a very militarized society, and every man had to join the army at the same age when they would be initiated into the Bacchanalia. And so there was this competition. That's why this oath of allegiance towards Bacchus could be stronger than the one that they had to swear to be part of the Roman army. The priests of these rites, male and female, are to be sought out, not only in Rome, but in all market towns and centers of population, so that they should be available for the consuls. No one should ever attempt to celebrate these ceremonies anymore. So I'm taking excerpts from Titus Livy, and this one, which came after the speech of Lucius Postumius, this is part of this new law that was promulgated, was created, called the Senatus Consultum de Bacchanalibus, which we know about from Titus Livy, the historian, but also we found actually in the 1700s, a copy of this law was found in southern Italy. It looks like this. So the text that I just read is part of this, and it's held in the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna. So if you go there, go visit it. It's a very important piece of history for the Dionysian and the Bacchanalia tradition. And yeah, it's the law that, as I just read, forbid any kind of ceremony. They forbid people, more than 5 people, to come together. So the smart thing is that they didn't forbid it completely, but they made it really difficult to have the authorization to perform the rites. So this was the trick that they used. So Titus Livius say, after the dismissal of the assembly, the whole city was seized by extreme terror. The following night, many people were caught escaping and were arrested. There was such a flight from the city that it resulted in a depopulation. Those who were found guilty of Bacchic worship were condemned to death. All Bacchic shrines were destroyed. So we hear this from Livy, the kind of fear that pervaded the people and the kind of mass repression that this triggered. And this is considered the first mass repression of a religious movement. But also I would like to focus on the fact that this is the first mass repression of people practicing altered state of consciousness in the West. And so this was the beginning also of the end of this ancient lineage that was coming all the way from the goddess culture of prehistory. So conclusions. The cult of Dionysus is a Greek adaptation of the prehistoric tradition of the mother goddess. Because of coming from Minoan Crete, and because Minoans themselves were coming from Anatolia, and Anatolia also being a place where during the Neolithic, the first settlements were created, Çatalhöyük, the Göbekli Tepe way earlier, before the Neolithic even, and these are all places where different historians have pointed out to the existence of a goddess culture. So I mentioned this because in this book that came out recently, The Immortality Key, great book, I just finished reading it, lots of information about beer and wine in the Mediterranean area. also connecting to David's presentation before. But I just want to point to the fact that the author calls it the secret history of the religion with no name. And I just want to suggest here that actually there was a name to this religion, that different feminist archaeologists, mainly but not only, defined the goddess culture of old Europe. This would probably turn into either a book from me or a series of presentations. I just want to name this here for the first time. According to this lineage, this cultural tradition, nature is sacred, gender is fluid. Altered states of consciousness are embedded in rituals to commune with the divine, the divine as nature, while promoting social cohesion, equality, psychological stability, and healing. This is a form of European historical shamanism, when what are now defined as shamanic culture, shamanic culture, but also defined as archaic techniques of ecstasy, rituals embedding altered state of consciousness. This is part of our Western tradition, our European tradition. This is when we were indigenous to our land, when we had this very close bond with nature. And it actually entered into history. So it's not just something happening in prehistory, it's also part of our historical phase. During Greek and Roman times, women and men and other genders looked into these practices for liberation from the constraints of a society that was increasingly patriarchal, hierarchical, misogynist, oppressive, and all of that. So their values questioned the very core of the newly born patriarchal culture. And because of their disruptive potentials, they were demonized and brutally repressed, socially, politically, and religiously. So this lineage continues all the way into early modern Europe with the witch hunts. It's still the same lineage. It's still the women making potions, dancing to the horned gods, a new version of Dionysus, but still the same lineage. And most of you maybe know, but I wanted to say this once again. So I'm concluding, how do we integrate all of this information into our daily life? What do we do with it? How do we reconnect with the cellular memory that we have in our bodies of these stories? And what can we do with it? And so this is also my question to you, if anyone wants to comment, or Sophie. And I want to thank you very much once again. These are my contacts. If you want to write me, connect with me, I would be very happy. Thank you very much.
Chiara, that was an extraordinary presentation. Thank you so, so much for bringing Dionysus back to us and his true holobiont self, that he's an assembly of radical women and non-binary people and wild animals and vegetation. I mean, personally, I always think the way we can honor him now is by collaborating with other people and other species. I am, can shoot you emails at length asking all of my very, minute questions about this tradition, but I want to open it up to people who are here, because I'm sure there's a lot of questions. Yeah, everybody loved the presentation so much. It was incredible. Go watch her other presentations, go read her books. She is so generous with what she's offering. Okay, let's bring on Parsifal.
Hi, thanks. That's really great. What I wanted to ask was, what was this, or was there also repression of this in Greek times? In my sort of vague reading of things, as the Greeks moved towards democracy, there were, philosophers saying, I can't get anything from, if I go outside of the city, all the wisdom is here. Nature has nothing for me. And so in many layers of the myths, I think like the Orpheus myth, as it kind of moves through time, I've felt this like a kind of resonance of what has felt like a dismissal and a banishment of this kind of worship. I wonder whether that's actually true, or whether there was any specific repression of it as part of the Greek move towards democracy.
So thank you for the question, because it's important to underline how paradoxical and ambiguous this lineage is, and Dionysus himself as an archetype. And so he was also seen always a bit of like an outsider in the Greek pantheon, even if, as I outlined, there is a possibility to trace him back at the roots of Greek civilization in Crete. But he was not considered one of the Olympians, because probably he was even coming from earlier. And he was considered the foreigner that arrives and creates a mess. And so if you read the Bacchae by Euripides, Dionysus arrives in Thebes. He convinces all the women to follow him on the mountains. And the king of Thebes, Pentheus, yes, he is completely against him. He's like, who are you to come here and take all our women and go on the mountain? Pentheus in the Bacchae is really representing a way of thinking that thinks that anything irrational, crazy, wild is not divine, or is not something that is worth of a spiritual religious practice. So the repressive drive was always present, because also it functions as a balancing act, like something to balance the fact that even if you leave the Dionysian energy run amok, it can be also destructive. And in the end of the Bacchae, it's a short text. It's an amazing text to see the ambivalence of this cult, because at the end, the women that are so high end up mistaking Pentheus for an animal and eating him alive, and dismembering him and eating him alive. And so Euripides wants to show the two sides. And so, as you said, this was the beginning of civilization in Greek. And so it was based on the principles of containment and balance and rationality, also the whole Apollinian set of values. And so it was challenging for them too. And also the Maenads, the women of Bacchus, they received a lot of criticism and judgment, and people saying that they were just prostitutes, or again, quoting Euripides. So yes, there was always this energy to repress the cult. And there was always also the energy to support the cult. And so the two energies have been playing out in history in different phases, giving birth to different possibilities for the integration of these experiences.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just also want to add that Dionysus is reinterpreted and remade by the Greeks when they come in and take over Minoan culture. So he's also a palimpsest of a palimpsest. He's the only Greek god, who's considered to have come before the pantheon, and is not referred to as a human deity, as a theos. He's always referred to as a daemon, which means that he represents something vegetal and non-human. So he's kind of an earlier holdout of a culture that then gets put into another culture that is much less wed to its actual nature reverent sensibility. So Chiara has done a great job of showing how that tension plays out. I think we have time for one more question. Can we bring on Thomas? Hello.
Hi, how's it going?
Can we highlight?
Thomas.
There we go. Hello.
Hi, Chiara. Thank you so much for that exciting presentation. I'm based in South Africa, and I'm a sacred activist, and I am also a media scholar. And a lot of my work while I was in the academy revolved around Emile Durkheim's work around collective consciousness. And I like what you were really saying about Dionysus also representing wine and intoxication. So, you know, in my work, that's kind of progressing from, you know, taking social justice work from just being discussed in the media to more ecstatic ceremony and community grounded rituals and activities that bring people together. I just wanted to maybe gain some clarity on, you know, this idea of Dionysus also being the god of intoxication and wine. So as far as that, you know, relates to this concept of collective effervescence, is that effect of intoxication achieved through, you know, libation once you're trying to invoke the Dionysian energy, or is it more to refer to after the people have taken the wine and they're all in an ecstatic state, they reach that synchronized state of like you were saying, you know, simultaneous thought and action. So I was just hoping maybe you could speak to that a bit, because, you know, in our indigenous knowledge systems here as well, we work with different types of alcohol and brews and so forth. Obviously, it's not wine and so forth, but sometimes, you know, there's controversy around whether the libation or the intoxication is for you to invoke the energy, for you to invoke the spirit, or whether it's for the spirit to be appeased and come. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, just yeah, please let me know and I'd be able to clarify a bit.
Thank you. What I understood is there is this question about the techniques and the values associated to them, or if there is a correspondence, if this intoxication, I mean, in terms of difference between libations and ingestion of the intoxicants, I don't know exactly how the ritual was structured back then. Probably there were both libations and ingestion. And there was a calling of the god for sure, because Dionysus is the god who comes, is the god that manifests as this collective state that arrives and takes possessions of the group. So there are those techniques and there are those tools, like specific plants that are used or fungi. But then there is also a set of values. And this is an area of research that I am going deeper and deeper, because even today with psychedelics, we are waking up to the fact that psychedelics not necessarily are all love and peace. You know, now that psychedelics are going mainstream, we are realizing that they can be politically pluripotent, is the word that I've found recently that is being used. What I wanted to point to in my presentation is that because this was a tradition, a specific cultural tradition coming from the goddess culture of prehistoric times, Neolithic and even Paleolithic, it seems like there was also a certain value system that was coming with it, that was egalitarian, that was inclusive, that was also really fostering bonds and the possibility to practice love and peace for real. And so when they were used within this frame of values, they gave amazing results. But the fact is, if the values change, these techniques can also be powerful to enhance another set of values: hierarchies, oppression, discrimination. So it's not just the techniques and the intoxicants themselves, it's the culture. And so I hope that with your groups, you said you are a social justice activist. This is exactly the kind of people I like to speak to about these stories, because there is a lineage, you know, we've been doing things to support these values. and to really create a society that honors these values. So thank you for your work.
Thank you for that. Yeah, if I could just make a closing comment and say, yeah, I mean, in a lot of the work that I do, you know, we tend to just associate collective consciousness with viral phenomena, things spreading quickly, you know, whether it's a public outrage or whatever it may be that gets people to take actions or sign petitions or whatever. But I really think, yeah, the work that you're doing is important in as far as those trance states that help people, you know, rise above the outrage and get behind the values, like you said. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was a great question and a great answer. I will say that if you're more interested in the political pluripotency, not even of psychedelics, but of these kinds of ritual states, the ways in which effervescence and collective experiences can fuel fascism is explored by Barbara Ehrenreich in Dancing in the Streets, which is really interesting. And that there are slight shifts to the value systems that can really change the way these things work. Chiara, you were incredible. This was such a rich offering. May it be the beginning of many more discussions. We've been so honored to have you here. Thank you. I want to close our session for today by just reminding everyone that Juliana Furchi's episode session will be sent out, which goes into, you know, the fungal aspects, the rhizomatic realm that underpins a lot of these gods as well. And I also wanted to invite everybody tomorrow to my free book launch event. So you can come and hang out with me at 4 p.m. EST if you're around, and I'm going to post the info in the chat where it's my book that is all about these weird vegetal gods. Here you go. Chiara, thank you so, so much. Everybody, if you want to unmute yourself and say goodbye, you can do that right now.
Gracias, Chiara.
Bye.
Hasta pronto.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.